everyone, and welcome back to How the Wise One Grows. Today, we are going to talk about the only thing that we know for certain in this life. It's the only thing that is going to happen to every single one of us, and the only thing that we know for sure to be true when we enter this life. And yet, it's something we shy away from, and it's taboo to talk about. But I think it's time that we stop fearing and start talking about death. And to guide us through this conversation and journey, we have a death doula with us today to help us learn how to face death and embrace it rather than avoid it so that we can live a more fulfilling and authentic life. And oh my gosh, how could I almost forget? Now is the time to remind you that right now, this very moment, this is your chance to support the podcast. So much love and work goes into putting each and every one of these episodes out, and none of it's possible without your support. So if this podcast has meant something to you, you can support it by joining the Dream Team for as little as $3 a month. You can think of it as a monthly coffee date for these weekly conversations and meditations. Click the link in the show notes to join and support this offering. And you can also support this podcast by following on your favorite streaming platform, leaving a review, I love reading your words, and sharing an episode you love with a friend and on social media. And if you join the Dream Team, you get a super special moment like this. It's time to thank our newest member of the Dream Team, Becky. Becky, you rule, you are so cool, and you make dreams come true. And you, listener, can be cool like Becky by clicking the link in the show notes to join the Dream Team and support the podcast. Ready, set, go. Before we dive into the conversation, let's take a moment to land here together with 3 deep breaths. So just take a moment to notice where your body makes contact with the earth. Take a big breath in, fill your chest and your belly with air. Exhale, open your mouth, let it out. Again, inhale, chest and belly expand. Exhale, let it all go. One more inhale. And exhale. And you can slowly open your eyes as you return to this space. I am so excited for our guest to be here today because we are going to talk about death. Something that doesn't happen too much, though it has been happening more and more on the pod lately. But today we have with us Jill McClennen. Jill is a certified death doula, a non-medical professional specifically trained to provide holistic care for individuals in their final stages of life. She offers comprehensive support, preparation, and deep soul healing to her clients and their families, whether in person or through virtual sessions, as she works as a death doula and end-of-life coach. Jill is a trauma-certified yoga instructor, as well as the host of the Seeing Death Clearly podcast. Jill, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about it. I love to talk about death, which I know is kind of shocking to a lot of people that are used to not talking about death ever, actually avoiding it as much as they can. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about it. I feel like in the last year, I've been trying to engage in these conversations about death more and more and have found so much beauty in holding space for it. So I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. Do you mind sharing just a bit about your background and how you became a death doula? And then we can kind of dive into what a death doula is.
Sure. So, my professional background has been in food service for many, many, many years. I started when I was in high school at like 16, and I'm 45 now, and I actually still work part time in food service. So, it's been my long term career. But I took care of my grandmother at the end of her life. And during that time, I owned a bakery with my husband. We had a six
Mm.
month old baby. And end of life caregiving was not what I expected because we don't see the realities of it on TV and in movies. And so when I was very happy to take on the role because I wanted to do that for my grandmother, I wanted to be
Mhm.
there for her. But I was just very confused and very overwhelmed. And hospice was amazing. I loved the hospice nurses that came in. One of them, actually, we still keep in touch. And this was 12, almost 13 years ago.
Mm.
And they were so kind and so compassionate and really took time to explain to me that all of these things that seemed really, quote unquote, weird and odd to me because
Mhm.
I wasn't expecting them were totally normal and natural experiences that people have as they near the end of life. And even at that point, I really started to think this feels like work that I want to do. This feels like really more of my calling. Like, again, I've been in food service a long time. There's things that I love about it, but it was never really like my calling. It was just kind
Mhm.
of, the job that I did, and I enjoyed it and I'm really good at it. But once I started thinking about working with people at the end of life, I was like, oh, this is good.
Mhm.
But, I had a bakery and I had a baby and ended up having another baby and closing the bakery. And, life just kind of moved on. And then in 2019, I heard of a death doula. And as soon as I heard it, I was like, oh, that's what I want to do. Because I didn't really want to go back to school to be a nurse. It just,
Mhm.
I saw a lot of what they did for my grandmother, and I appreciate that there's people that do these things, but it just wasn't really what I wanted. And so once I heard about a death doula, I was like, oh, this is it. This is what I want to do, which is the spiritual support, the emotional support, helping people work through their fears and their anxieties, and helping families understand, educating families, preparing people for the realities of what death and dying is going to look like. And I started, really getting a little anxious because at that point I was about 40 and I was like, oh man, am I really going to completely switch careers? But there's actually, a lot of my food service background comes in handy when I'm doing this work because I'm very good at service. I'm very good at helping
Mm.
people. And so I just kind of have brought all of those skills over into my death doula work.
Mhm. So is that the primary way a death doula differs from more traditional end of life care like a nurse because it focuses on the more spiritual and emotional elements of death? Or do you mind diving into that a bit more?
That's definitely a lot of it. That if anybody's heard of a birth doula, right, we're very
Mhm.
similar in the role that there's no medical care that is provided by doulas. We're really there to support people through really just big transitions in the natural human existence, right? Not everybody
Mhm.
has a baby, but everybody is going to die. Whether we
Mhm.
want to admit that or not, we will all die. We just don't know when. And death doulas really can be there to support you, even if you're not actively nearing death. That's one of the things that I've been trying to talk to a lot of people about is that because so many of us are so afraid of even thinking about end of life, what we would want at the end of life, we're not prepared. And even just locally last week, one of our neighbors, the 48-year-old husband, had a heart attack and died, left behind two
Mhm.
kids and a wife. Same, I mean, could have been me and my husband. Kids are the same age. He even has the same name as my husband. Like, and we just don't know.
Mhm.
And I know it's hard for people to think about that, but not thinking about it isn't going to prevent that from happening any more than thinking about it is going to make it happen. But I want people to feel prepared as best as we can for the inevitable happening at any point. And so whether that's, talking about what we want at the end of life, making sure that our legal paperwork is in order, working through our fears and our anxieties. What are we most afraid of about death? Because it kind of falls into a few categories. People are either afraid of the suffering that they might experience at the end of life. Well, there's a lot of things we could do for that to make sure that people are comfortable. People are afraid of what comes after because we don't know. Well, I mean, I can't tell you that for sure. None of us know for sure, but we can have conversations about it and really work through some of the fears and the anxiety so that no matter what stage in life you're at. And that's why I'll sometimes now say end of life coach more than I even say death doula, because I had a lot of people say to me, "You sound like you're a life coach." And I was like, I guess kind of. I'm just at the end of life.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's important for all of us to think through these things no matter where we're at.
Yeah, I think you bring up a lot of interesting points. And I want to first lean into like, death is the only thing we know for certain about life. That's the only thing we know to be true when we come into this earth, is that we will leave it and we will die. Yet there's so much resistance around it. And earlier you mentioned something about like thinking about death doesn't make it like any more prominent. I think that when we can acknowledge that reality of death, that is a great act of surrender and acceptance. And I've said this equation on the podcast before, and I'll say it again. Shinzen Young's equation is suffering equals pain times resistance. In life, pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. And I think we add a lot of extra suffering around death because we resist it. Like, it's a pain unit, that's a part of life, that's going to happen. There can also be some great beauty to it, but by resisting it, we suffer so much more, whether it's our own death or the grief of someone we've lost. So I think it's really great work that you're doing, and important to shed a light on. Travel is one of the things that helps me grow the most. And that's why this year I decided to put in some time to find the best travel rewards credit card that I could. And I ended up getting the Chase Sapphire Preferred credit card. And so far, I love it. It's got a ton of flexibility, it gives you great rewards points. And when you sign up, you get some bonus points. And I actually have a referral link in the show notes if you are interested in getting a Chase Sapphire Preferred or Sapphire Reserved credit card. It will give you and I some extra little points so that we can continue to travel and grow together. Something you have mentioned before as well is like, it's so important for us to talk about death, which we so often resist and shy away from. And I guess I want to start with like, one, like, why are we afraid to talk about death? But even a layer deeper is like, why do you think we're so afraid of death, if that's the only thing we know?
Well, I think they're actually pretty tied together. We don't talk
Mm-hmm.
about it because we're so afraid of it. We're so
Mm-hmm.
afraid of it because we don't talk about it. And so it became this really kind of taboo subject that even when we've tried to talk about it with loved ones, think even children, when they ask questions, what do? We lie to children, like the goldfish died. Oh, we're just going to go out and buy him a new one. Like the
Mm-hmm.
dog dies, we're going to come up with all these like stories rather than having a conversation with children. And so by the time that we actually have to face death, even whether it's our own, say, we get a terminal diagnosis and it's like death is like in our face of like, you're going to die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that happens to a loved one, or God forbid, somebody, dies suddenly. Again, it happens all the time. We're so overwhelmed because we've avoided it for so long that it really ends up being almost like a traumatic experience where
Yeah.
we don't know how to process everything that's coming up. Things get said between family members that are just downright cruel sometimes, it ends up being an experience that then we don't want to ever face it ever again. So even the thought of it, like even for my family, we went through an experience around a grandmother dying that it just was not good. People are still not speaking in my family because of it. And so now we all have that experience as part of our memory of like death. Well, it's not really death. It was other stuff that was coming up within the family that just got triggered by the fact that my grandmother was dying. It wasn't her death that was so traumatic, it was all the other stuff that happened. And so now all of us are going into our next experiences with that old pain and that fear. And the more that we don't talk through what happened, like it's not like any of us are talking about it. It's not like we sit down and we have a conversation like, hey, by the way, those things that were said, I'm really sorry. I didn't really mean it. We're all just acting like none of it happened, or we're just not talking to each other. And so it just leads to us holding all of that inside. And then the next time we have to face a death, it's going to come up. And so we really need to talk about it. The more it's like, what are they? You got to feel to heal, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it really is true that we need to feel the emotions around death and dying and grief and all the unprocessed stuff that we're holding on to. And part of doing that is going to be having conversations that might be a little difficult to start with, but the more that you do it, the easier it gets. But it can be difficult because sometimes you want to have the conversation with a loved one. I mean, I've even talked to people that work in hospice and they'll say, my spouse won't talk to me about what they want at the end of life. Like every time I try to, they change the subject, they shut it down, they start making
Mm-hmm.
jokes. And this is what I do for a living. And they still won't talk to me. So, like, I try to gently encourage people to have the conversations, to start the conversations. And that's even one of the things that I do as a death doula is I can just help mediate conversations between people, help get the conversation started, help make it so that it stays on track and it's not that, siblings are fighting with each other over something that really has nothing to do with it. But we really do need to talk about it. And the
Mm-hmm.
more that we talk about it, the less uncomfortable it will get.
Yeah, it's just like any other muscle. You gotta use it to start to strengthen it and for it to grow. And as you were talking, I started to have the thought too is I think a part of why there's so much fear around death and conversations around death is in part because it's the only thing we can't prove what happens after.
Mm,
Like, there are so many beliefs, and you can hold on to yours in the way that supports you, and that's great. And there's no like concrete scientific data that's like, when X happens, Y occurs. It's like, it's the unknown.
hmm
And that I think is something we often aren't encouraged to learn how to be with in this life is the unknown, even though life is unknown all the time. Um, and I think that can make having conversations around death really challenging because there's not quite language for what we don't know. We can talk about this like ethereal sense of uncertainty and all these things, but at some point, there aren't ever words that will convey what death is. So I think that can almost cripple the conversation. When you work with someone who is dying and they're having big emotions, how do you help them process those emotions and that reality, that imminence of death?
I try to ask a lot of questions and then just listen a lot. I actually even sat once with a woman that was in the hospital. It's the only time I ever saw her. I sat with her for like 2 hours, I think. And I maybe said, I don't know, 5 or 6 things in the 2 hours. And by the
Mm-hmm.
time that we were done, she said, oh, you are so wise. You are so wonderful. Like she was just praising me for how amazing I was. And I'm thinking, I didn't really do anything. I didn't really even say anything, but I just let her talk.
Mm-hmm.
And the conversation tends to flow where they'll talk about fears, they'll talk about anxieties, they'll talk about what they think maybe is coming for them after death. Because even
Mhm.
though we think we know what we believe, when we're actually facing death, it's pretty surprising how many people will actually change their beliefs. A lot of times go
Mm.
back to the religious beliefs that they had at childhood.
Mhm.
And so, like, there's a lot of processing that's going on there. And then they'll be talking about it. And then all of a sudden they'll go off on a tangent. And like she started talking about Christmas cookies, like it
Uh-huh.
was like, so we kind of go all over the place. But I think that's there, and that's the natural way to talk about something that's a little uncomfortable. Is like we'll
Mhm.
talk about the uncomfortable for a little bit and then we'll go somewhere that's more comfortable and then we'll
Mhm.
swing back. And so my job is usually just to kind of keep asking, and that's really a lot of it is just listening to people. I'm not there to tell them what to believe.
Mhm.
I'm not there to tell them that it's going to be okay,
Yeah.
because so many times we want to do that, like, no, you're going to be fine, everything's going to be
Mhm.
fine. I mean, yeah, it's going to be fine. I mean, you're going to die. I
Yeah.
mean, it is what it is, but I just want to be able to be realistic with somebody, because they'll even sometimes ask, like, well, how much longer do you think it'll be? Like, nobody really knows. Even a doctor can't tell you how
Mhm.
much longer. And some people will hang on for a really long time at the end for whatever reason. I mean, nobody knows for sure. There's a lot of theories, but nobody
Mhm.
knows for sure. And so when I'm with people that are nearing the end of life, it's also interesting too, because sometimes people get themselves to a place where they're ready and then it's not happening. And then they're like, well, now I just want it to like happen because now I'm
Yeah.
prepared. I'm ready. And it feels like it's just not just dragging on. And I'm like, well, it'll happen in its own time. I mean, that's the thing. The body knows what to do. We really
Mhm.
view death as this like medical emergency, and it's really not. The body will know what to do on its own. And sometimes I'll talk to people and they'll say, well, they'll die when it's God's will. And I'm like, yes, but also they'll die when we take off their breathing machines and their IVs. And like, so it's not really God's will when we have them hooked up to all of this machinery that has kept them alive. And that's where it gets to be a really tricky place working with
Mhm.
people at the end of life, because I am there to support people no matter what, even if what they believe is not what I believe, as far as like religious beliefs or
Mhm.
even what they want at the end of life. But it's really hard because now we can keep a body alive for a really long time. And that just puts a lot of people in a place where, again, it makes the experience more traumatizing for family members. And then we have to make decisions where, in the past, that wasn't the case. I mean, people would die naturally, and now we don't really do that. And that's why, even, most people have probably heard of something called a DNR, a do not resuscitate.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people in end of life care that are now trying to change the language to allow natural death,
Mm.
because it's not that we're saying don't resuscitate somebody. Like, if I was to collapse right now at 45 and healthy, like, yes, then you would be resuscitating me. But if
Mhm.
somebody is, in their 80s, or if they're just at the end of a long terminal illness, you're allowing them to die naturally. And that's what
Yeah.
most people would want if you were to actually talk to them. But it doesn't always happen. We end up with these treatments and these, machines and all these things.
Yeah, I think sometimes we fight death so much. We try to prolong life so much when sometimes it's time for death. I even had a friend who had, terminal cancer, and they moved to Washington State so that he could have the choice to, take care of that choice when it was time, to not suffer anymore unnecessarily. If you know what's going to happen and if you're ready for it, We don't need to turn to these endless extremes to stay alive, because death is, in my experience, much harder for the living. I think for the person who's going through that, once you die, I like to hold the belief that there's something freeing, something beautiful that happens. And then it's sad for us here on earth because you're not physically with us in your body, but also your spirit is. And there's a window to me that it can open up to um, making life more alive when
Mhm.
someone in your life dies.
Yeah, and I think for me, a lot of it, when I think about the sadness that we have after somebody dies, a lot of times it's, yes, we miss them. We miss being with them physically, but a lot of it is the regrets and the
Mm.
shame and the guilt. And, anytime, because now because I think about death so much, because I talk about it so much, I kind of do this little like activity in my head where, for example, yesterday I went to the park with my family and my kids were like bickering a little bit about, I don't know, whatever they were bickering about. And in the past, I would have gotten very frustrated. Part of me would have shut down. I would have wanted to just like look at something on my phone to distract myself. I would have
Mm-hmm.
convinced myself I had something really important to do, reading an email or whatever, right? And now I just watch it and I think, what if you were dead and you were a ghost? Would you want to be looking at your phone, or would you be taking every single moment to look at every little hair on your child's head? What would
Mm-hmm.
you be doing? And so it allows me to just be so much more present, because I feel like, if, God forbid, if one of my children were to die, I would give anything to have them back and fighting with each other. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be looking at my phone if I had a minute to even go back in time and be with them. So there's so much, even now, like I'm still processing some shame and some guilt and regrets of like when they were little, when I was like
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed and I was exhausted and I would just check out and I would distract myself and I would self medicate with like drinking or marijuana or just leaving the house because I just couldn't deal. Like, I still have some regrets and shame about that. But now I'm so much more present every moment that I have with them. So, not that it would be easy for me if my husband or my children were to die, but I know that I wouldn't have that same feeling of, wow, I wish I would have, shown up more. I wish I would have been here more. I wish I would have taken the time to really fully be present with them. And part of getting to that understanding was because I have learned so much about the regrets and the shame and all the things that people have when somebody dies or when they're dying themselves. And it has changed my life.
Yeah, I think that death is what makes life worth living. The impermanence of life is what makes it beautiful. And when a death happens, it opens our eyes to that. We stop taking it for granted and we can start living life more fully. You see the magic in it again. And that's a hard thing, but it's a gift. I think that's the death is the greatest gift of life because of that. Um, yeah. So I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, especially what you're saying, those moments of life that it's so tempting, because life is pain. Like, pain is a part of life. It's so tempting to want to numb that, to resist it, to run away from it. But that's the wholeness right
Mhm.
there. That's the part of it too. So can we fully be here for our lived experience? Because this is it. And it's not going to last forever for us or for anyone else.
Yeah, and learning to go with the flow in life has definitely helped me too, where, there is always going to be pain in life. But like you said, it doesn't have to mean that I need to suffer
Mm-hmm.
terribly because of the pain. And so now I just got to this place where, between my meditation practice that I've had for a long time, but now it seems to have like really started to sink in, this idea of just not being attached to any of it, the good or the bad, and just kind of being like, it just is what it is. For this
Mm-hmm.
moment, it is what it is. It's not going to be forever. And 99% of the time, if I was to stop and get really quiet within
Mm-hmm.
me and look at whatever's happening, it's fine. Like it's a perfect moment. Even moments that are difficult, even moments that are painful, if I could really just get some clarity around it, I mean, overall, it's fine. I'm here. My children are healthy. I have a roof over my head. I have food. Maybe I don't have extra money. Maybe I don't have all these things. My business isn't thriving. Like all the things that part of my brain wants to keep telling me is wrong with everything in my life. If I could really just shut the brain up just even a little bit and look around, I'm like, you know what? My life is perfect. It's perfect the way that it is, because
Mm-hmm.
the things that matter most I have. And
Mm-hmm.
so the other stuff doesn't really matter, but the brain and social media and society just plants all this like garbage in our heads about what's important in life. And so sometimes when days are bad, I'm like, all right, just get really clear on what is really going fine, and
Yeah.
it usually does help. And now I have less bad days. I just don't react the same way to situations like I used to. I just
Mm-hmm.
react in a much calmer way where I'm like, all right, whatever. It is what it is.
This is happening right now. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you can acknowledge, because you know that life is temporary, you know that the wide range of emotions, the good days, the bad days, are temporary too. When you stop resisting death, you can stop resisting life
Mm-hmm.
and the fullness of that experience. Earlier, we were talking about how a fear of death and conversations around death are really prominent for most people. And I believe you've talked before about how most of our fears actually trace back to a fear of death, even if
Mm-hmm.
we aren't like conscious of it. Do you mind sharing maybe an example of that and leaning into like how can we start to look at our fears and notice if they're rooted in a fear of death, and how do we work with that?
Yeah, it's really one of my favorite topics to think about, and to really kind of talk about, because every time I think of somebody's, fears and phobias and really any fear that we have, when I really dig into it deeper and deeper, the root of it is always the fear of death.
Mm,
I mean, think about any phobia, right? Whether it's fear of heights, fear of spiders, fear of, being around groups of people, fear of the
mm-hmm,
ocean, whatever it is, it's because we're afraid we're going to die.
mm-hmm,
And if we could get really clear on that idea, first off, of like, well, why are we afraid of those things? I mean, I don't know, again, depending on how, down the rabbit hole you want to go with things. Some of it, I sometimes do think if there is such a thing as a past life, maybe it is a past life. Like I've had a fear of deep water since I was a child, but yet I'm an excellent swimmer. I was a lifeguard for many years, but there's still part of me that when I'm like on a boat and we're in deep water, like I feel it. I'm like, nope, I don't
mm-hmm,
want to be here. I don't like this. And that
mm-hmm,
was when I first started hearing about past lives, because I was telling somebody that, and they're like, maybe you drowned in a past life. And I
mm-hmm.
was like, it's possible. I don't know. But either way, again, it's because I died that way. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's the fear of death. And so then I started thinking even about me. I don't really have many fears and phobias anymore, but I am slightly antisocial in the sense of like we live in a small community. I kind of stick to myself. I don't really like being around a lot of people because I feel like people have always kind of thought I was a little weird, which I am a little weird and I'm okay
Weird
with
is
that.
good.
Exactly. I think weird is good too. But when you're in groups of small town people, sometimes the weird is not good. And so then again, I started to think about it and I'm like, well, why do I worry about it? Well, because when you're the weird woman in town, history will prove that
Mm-hmm.
they often got killed.
Yeah, you're the
And
witch. You're the
oh,
you're
the
when
whatever,
you
the
don't
whore, the
belong. Yeah.
oh, totally. And
Mm-hmm.
even, then I started thinking about the idea of like the mother wound and the sister wound. And, like I don't tend to have a lot of female friends. And again, it's partially because of just like bad experiences in the past where I got really close with a woman and then the relationships ended up like falling apart. And then it fell apart because it got to a point where we were just like both trying to like be the one in charge essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
then I was like, well, why is that? And I was like, well, that's because society tells us that you have to be the woman in charge because, you have to have the attention of the man. You need to be the one to get that. Like, it really again went back to this idea of like, well, if I am not in charge, that means I'm going to be the one that gets pushed out, which means I'm going to be the one that's going to like, die by myself on the streets, like it
Yeah,
just
it traces back to survival. We seek
always.
connection with humans, we seek belonging because of these core survival needs, even people pleasing tendencies. I think we talked about
Hmm.
that in episode 37 of how that root is a root. It's a root fear of survival, of needing to belong, to have our needs met and be taken care of. So I think you're really spot on with all of our fears. We can
Hmm.
trace back to this fear of death. And when we stop fearing death, we stop fearing life.
Yeah, it's true because so many times I have stopped myself from going out and engaging with people because I just didn't want to feel uncomfortable. And, now that I got really clear about a lot of it, I'm like, honestly, no, nobody's going to kill me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if somebody threatens me, like it's not likely to happen. Could it happen? Of course. Is it likely to happen? No.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's the worst that happens? They think I'm weird. They don't want to talk to me. Okay, fine. And so now I'm starting to get like more involved with things. And I'm finding that, again, I'm living life better where my daughter's on a softball team. She's 9, right? So it's like little kids. They're not very good, but it's adorable, right? And so, like, you go to the games and it is just so like wholesome, like small
Mm-hmm.
town wholesome. But again, in the past, I would have just been a little bit uncomfortable. I wouldn't have wanted to be there. There would have always been part of me that was just like thinking about other things, trying to be somewhere else. I wouldn't have been able to relax and feel good. And I noticed a couple weeks ago at one of her softball games, I was just like watching these other little kids play and I was like listening to the noises and watching the sun come like over these trees. And the whole thing was just so amazing. And I was so present. I was so just in that moment. And it was beautiful. And I was like, wow, this is really great. Like, this is what I want. This is how I want to live my life all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so working with that idea of like, why am I so afraid to be around groups of people? Again, they're not going to kill me. And if they do, they're not going to get away with it. So it's fine. Like, it'll be fine. But I really was so happy to be able to feel that experience the way that I felt it, because that is the
Mm-hmm.
way I want to live my life.
In my experience, when there is proximity to death, whether like I have friends who've had near death experiences or a loved one dies, there is one side of the coin that's the beauty of like, wow, like you see life so differently. You can live life much more fully. It's almost like there's a window of that, and the window like kind of goes away and it's easier to fall back into old patterns. But then there's also a side of the coin where it makes living life the same way hard. It makes like connecting with people, I think, a little bit harder because you see what matters and you see a way of living so differently. I would be curious about, if, as someone who works in death like all the time, how do you hold the beauty of the gifts it gives you and still allow yourself to live fully in this life and connect with others in an authentic way?
I've I think that I've always been, that's part of why I didn't connect with people, was because there
Mm-hmm.
was always a part of me that didn't want to gossip. I didn't want to chit chat. I didn't want to talk about sports and,
Mm-hmm.
in politics, even though I am engaged in politics. Like, there was just so much of what was going on with other humans that I was like, look, y'all, like, this is just not the important stuff. Let's talk about the
Mm-hmm.
important stuff. And so I've always had a hard time really connecting with other people. But now, I don't know, it has gotten easier. And I think partially because in the past, there was always a little part of me that was like looking forward to dying just because I wanted this experience to be done. I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to kill myself, but it was more like, I don't know, if it happened tomorrow, I would be okay with that because
Mm-hmm.
there's not really much here that is kind of worth experiencing. And I don't like realizing that that's the way I used to feel, but it was.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can connect with people. And even though sometimes it's frustrating because I still want the same thing, where I'm like, I want to have these different conversations. Like, I don't want to chit chat. I don't want to be at a party listening to you talk about your kid's soccer team or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's when I will kind of do that practice again of where I almost imagine what it would be like if I wasn't in this physical body and I was experiencing this from a
Mm.
different place. Or if it was just a memory. If I was on my deathbed and I was looking back at this softball game or this party or this conversation that I didn't really want to be in because it was not interesting to me, right? These things that I used to feel in the past, now I'm more, it's almost like I could see life more as just like a game, as like a
Mm-hmm.
movie that I'm just kind of participating in. And it just makes it much more pleasurable sometimes to think of it that way of, even if our soul does go on, right? Like, if I die and this physical body is gone, but the Jill, right? The me that makes me Jill goes on, it'll never be this experience again. I'll never
Mm-hmm.
have this body. I'll never be able to touch my child's face again. I'll never be able to smell the smells that I smell and taste the things that I taste. And like, this will never be here again. And that's okay. I'm not going to attach myself to this idea and want to grasp it and hold on to it, but I'm going to appreciate it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it actually has really made it so that even though there is times when I still really wish, like, I would love if everybody would talk to me about death. And I think that's the thing now too, is that, when I say what I do, when people, ask like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, oh, I'm a death doula. I work with people at the end of life. Either people do want to talk to me about it and they want to tell me the stories of when their loved one died, or, whatever it is, or they get really freaked out and they want to walk away. And so then I'm like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
sure, let's talk about death. And if you really don't want to talk to me, that's okay too. But
Mm-hmm.
it has changed me deeply. Honestly, it
Mm-hmm.
has.
Yeah, I think there's so much to the impermanence of life. That's kind of been the thread throughout this conversation of like that we can savor the sweetness of it because it's impermanent, in the highs and the lows, the good days, the bad days. They're all fleeting, just like
Mhm.
this life is. And I'm so glad that you are holding space for so many people to be with death in their last days and to prepare for death and have more conversations about it. And by doing so, helping us make life more alive. Do you mind sharing for anyone listening what would be like one bit of advice you would give listeners to uh, stop fearing their death and to feel more alive today?
I think probably the best piece of advice, and I want to say quote unquote advice, because it's not really that there's any advice to help anybody be less afraid of death.
Mm-hmm.
But just don't be afraid to look at it and to think about it and
Mm-hmm.
to, have the conversations and to learn more about it. And when it does start to feel uncomfortable, ask yourself why. What
Mm-hmm.
is it that is making you feel uncomfortable? And then if you can kind of get to even a little bit of that why, it'll help you just work through it and be able to continue down this path of really just creating a healthier relationship with death and dying. And just naturally you will start to live your life differently. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a conscious decision. It will just happen naturally the more comfortable you get with death.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe a good place to start is if listening to this episode has been helpful for you, a way you can open the door to a conversation is like share this episode with someone in your life and, give them a few days and then try to start talking about it together. Open that
Mhm.
door.
I also
Thank
have a
you. Mm-hmm.
Facebook group too where I post
Mm,
questions almost every day. I sometimes don't on the weekends. And they're not always very specific about death, but they're just questions to get people thinking. And I've had a lot of comments. People will message me, or I'll run into somebody out in public that I don't even know is in my group, and they'll say, your conversation or your questions have started conversations between me and my family, because I'll tell them the question and then we start talking about it. And so, that's why I do the group. It's not like I'm in there selling. It really is just, I want people to start thinking about things and then starting the
mm-hmm.
conversation. So people are always welcome to join my group just to get little tastes of some things you can think about.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to get the link to that group from you and I'll have it in the show notes for anyone who wants to join. And
Perfect.
for people listening, what are other ways we can support you and your work?
Do have a podcast, Seeing Death Clearly, and I try to do conversations with, quote unquote, normal people, like people that don't work in end of life, but just want to
Mm-hmm,
talk
mm-hmm,
about death and their experiences. But then I do actually talk to people that have written books, all kinds of professionals in the end of life area, so that,
mm-hmm.
again, we could just get used to hearing conversations about death and dying. And then, I work with clients, in person or virtual at any stage of life, to work through fears and anxieties, to have a conversation and get clear on what you would want for your end of life care at any time. And I work with end of life caregivers. So just kind of, if there's anybody out there that needs any type of support around anything having to do with end of life, email me and I do, a complimentary 30-minute session to kind of talk and see what your needs are and see if I would be able to be helpful.
Awesome. And I'll make sure that I have all your info in the show notes for people to connect with you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, Jill, thank you so much for having this really important conversation with us today. And I appreciate you, the work that you do, and I hope that we can keep talking about death.
Perfect. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
This is your invitation to support this podcast and this offering into the world by joining the Dream Team today. You can think of it as a monthly coffee date for these weekly conversations and meditations. Click the link in the show notes to join and support this offering. And you can also support this podcast by following on your favorite streaming platform, leaving a review. I love reading your words, and sharing an episode you love with a friend and on social media.